discussing the threats against Christianity.
Satan, Lucifer, Mephistopheles, the Lord of Flies, Baphomet, the one who's always been behind the evil secret societies, all the conspiracies of the world, the witchcraft, the Satanism, so forth. All of the things that have been done in the name of the devil or in spite of the devil. But where did this idea come from? Where did it originate? Who introduced the name? And how did it develop over time? Surely, when it was introduced, it wasn't a red man, a red goat man. And surely, this is something that people have taken quite seriously. And if that's the case, then we should look to the actual matter, that being the Old Testament, the New Testament, and all of the Apocrypha, to actually see where this idea is coming from, what the source material says about this character of the devil, as opposed to what is put on this character after the fact, post-biblically. How did all the wickedness of the world get a name? Does the devil rule hell? Is the devil Lucifer? Is the devil a fallen angel? Is the devil actually opposed to God? Who is Belial? Who is Abaddon? Who is the serpent in the garden? Now, a lot of people have said a lot of things about the devil, especially in regards to these questions. So let's proceed with a mind of investigation, with an open interpretation. Let's earnestly ask, who is the biblical devil? In truth, to answer where this all began, we would have to devote a whole session to the history of mythological evil. The origin of evil has been dealt with in a handful of different ways, mythologically speaking. If we go to the ancestor of all religions, animism and shamanism, then it tends to be given to a feud between brothers, to an uncontrolled primordial being. If we go further in time and we look at the Babylonians and the Sumerians, then evil is a consequence of the gods, that if we don't appease and if we don't do whatever we can to placate them, then evil is inevitable. But what's relevant for this subject is Zoroastrianism, and that's because of this invention of dualism, or this pushing forward of dualism, this idea of that which is good and that which is bad, separating these things distinctly. In Zoroastrianism, this pre-Abrahamic Persian religion, there is Ahura Mazda, who is the beneficent creator, and there is Angremenu, that which is evil, and in contention with that which is good. In Zoroastrianism, Angremenu is almost as powerful as Ahura Mazda, and so there's some contention here. Now, before the Abrahamic religions became the Abrahamic religions, before the initial scriptures, they were polytheistic. They were the Canaanites. And these people were caught up in Babylon. Persia conquered Babylon and set them free. And when they returned to their homelands, they brought with them this influence from Zoroastrianism and became strictly monotheistic. But as we'll see, it will take time to work out how to integrate this monotheism, how to integrate this dualism that is introduced. And this can help explain some contradictions. So let's get into it. If we look at the very beginning of the Old Testament in Genesis, then it's quite apparent that the evil in this world is because of us. Eve chose to eat the apple. Adam chose to eat the apple. This, in one interpretation, is the reason, the origin of evil in the world. Our fault, our guilt, our shame, our redemption, our hope for redemption. And we'll be getting to the serpent later, but in this story, by itself, the serpent isn't to blame. We are to blame. So far, there's no need for a devil. Evil is accounted for. If we go later in the Bible and we look to Deuteronomy, you'll find plenty of confirmation that God controls both good and evil, is more than willing to send plagues and diseases, long-withstanding suffering to any who do not follow the law. So immediately we can see there's some confusion with regards to the origin of evil. Is it because of what happened in the Garden of Eden? Is God actually in control of both? If all the plagues and all the diseases, murders, all of the tragedies of the world are in fact because of God, this is a bit hard to accept. Perhaps we could introduce something else that will better tie up these loose ends. And here is the introduction of the devil. But let's take care of something first. What are these names? Satan, the devil. Well, the devil is easier to deal with because that's Greek. Diablos meant the slanderer or the accuser. This is more of a leaning towards the devil's advocate or the one who argues against you, like a lawyer. Satan, though, is a little more confusing because the word isn't just the character. In Hebrew, Satan means adversary or the enemy. So the word is used plenty to just refer to anyone who is an enemy. When it comes to the Old and the New Testament, when it's ha-Satan, meaning the enemy, that is when we designate it as this character. It is a distinctive persona, personality, being. So it should be noted that there is some confusion to bear with when it comes to when this word occurs before it's translated into English. Our introduction of this character appears to be in the book of Job. And here, this presumable heavenly figure, never outright stated as an angel, very much earns the name antagonist. God here gives all the permissions for his servant, Satan, to destroy Job's property, to kill his children, to take away his crops, to give him disease. He just can't kill him. Satan's request here is to test Job. So everything that is done is by God's will. Now, there's plenty to say when it comes to interpreting the allegory behind the story of Job. Why God responds to Job's suffering with, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Is this an arrogance, or is this to say that the process of becoming as a human being requires this yin and yang, this left and right hand of God, this imposed suffering that brings one to become a certain way, or simply just to say there are greater factors at work beyond human comprehension? So in this, we might genuinely ask ourselves, what is the role of Satan here? Because it's very apparent that our former line of distinguishing that God controls good and evil intentionally when it comes to the Bible, the Old Testament, the introduction of Satan here is of little intrigue overall. He's just playing a part. There is a somewhat contentious interpretation of angels in Christianity and in Judaism, that they are luminaries, that they are constellatory. They are literally in the heavens. They are the constellations up there. all subservient to God, all doing God's bidding, so forth. If we were to look at our solar system, this many planets away from us is the sun, that of which is beneficent and good. And that many planets in the opposite direction away from us is Saturn. Saturn has always been understood as suffering. In deep mythology, Capricorn is Saturn. Accordingly, we could make this as a leap to understand why the devil eventually becomes a goat. But we're not going to deal with that right now. This is just to establish that if all of the luminaries and all of the planets are doing God's bidding, then Saturn is one of those astrological emanations. And accordingly, Satan could just be the part of Saturn. It's just an interpretation. We're here to give interpretations, so there's one. But while we're here, let's do something technical. We can technically age the devil. And what do I mean? They say in the religious tradition that Moses wrote the book of Job. And they say that Moses lived roughly between 1400 BCE to 1270 BCE. That would mean that the idea of Satan in Abrahamic religions is roughly 3,200 years old. But if instead we were to go down the academic route, a higher part of the estimate would say that the book of Job was written in 500 BCE, and in which case the idea of Satan, or the personification of Satan, would be 2,500 years old. But let's get back in the book. Now, if we are regularly interpreting, conventionally interpreting the Bible, then eagle-eyed people would be quick to point out that no, the devil didn't first appear in the book of Job. The devil appeared in Genesis as the serpent. But the problem there is that the serpent is never referred to as Satan. The serpent is simply the serpent. And the only reason that people assume that it's Satan, other than headcanon and prognosis, is because of what is said later in the New Testament in Revelations. This refers to Satan as an ancient serpent called the devil, the one who deceives the whole world. But this would be to say that Revelations, that was written roughly 68 to 98 CE, would be finally acknowledging or retconning that of which was written by the biblical tradition at least 1,000 years beforehand? And would it be heresy to ask, if Genesis wanted the serpent to be interpreted as Satan, why would Genesis not state it? Instead, we're left to assume or stitch things together that were written very far apart. All I'm saying here is that this is an assumption. This is not stated in the text. And the nature of interpreting serpents in the Bible is horribly confusing. You have Nehushtan, the staff that Moses held up and that cured people. That curing of people via the snake was commanded by God. Then you have the seraphim, who are flaming snakes that are closest to God. The nature of the serpent in the Bible is horribly confusing. And we'll touch on Revelations a bit later, but to assume that the reference to Satan being a serpent is purely physical, that he's literally a serpent, is strange, because in my mind, interpreting Revelations in a sensible way is to include astral theology, that the serpent here is Draco, the constellation that is the serpent. I fully understand why people want to infer this connection, but what I really want to point out is there's a lot more at work here than we might assume. Our job in this session is to look at the idea of Satan as a development and to explore these different ideas. So Let's continue, because we have yet another troublesome topic, let's just put it that way, and that's Belial. For context, Belial translates generally as worthless. So when the name is used, we can assume that's what it's referring to. This word happens across the Old Testament into the New. But in the same way as Satan and Ha-Satan are distinguished in their translations, so too is the use of Belial. A handful of times throughout the Bible, there are claims of the sons or daughter of Belial. In this case, it would imply that this is an entity as opposed to just simply meaning worthless. But perhaps we should look at this through a mythological lens, and that is to say that the personification is the attribute. And what I mean by that is the god of the sky is literally what the sky does. The god of rain is literally the act of rain. And in this case, the attribute of something being worthless or undignified is both a spiritual entity and a phenomena. Why I bring this up is because in Corinthians, there is the implication that this is a name for Satan. But this has been interpreted a host of different ways, this greater concept of Belial, that this is in fact something distinct from Satan in the sense that Satan punishes that which Belial does. To make this a little bit more clear, if Satan judges or tests human beings, he is trying to do so for God. Okay. Belial, then, is this thing outside of that power structure and leads people towards unworthiness. And in which case, Belial would actually be the Angler Menu, or the purely negative aspect that would have been inspired from Zoroastrianism. This subject is confused. If we look to those that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, then there are a number of epithets given to Belial, one being the angel of darkness, another being the spirit of wickedness, the prince of the luminaries, and then yet another, the spirit of truth. This seems to be one of those concepts that has never quite been nailed down appropriately, either canonically or apocryphally. So this is yet another case where this is in fact much more confusing than one might assume. There's much more work to be done in the way of open interpretation. But while we're here, we might as well talk about Apocrypha and the role it plays in the development of Satan and the devil. And one that I think is really evocative, really provoking, is the Book of Enoch. Here, all the evil of the world is done by fallen angels. They are the reason that evil is in the world in a substantial way. This is the classic angels came to earth and mated with women and created giants, so on. And God needed to create the flood in order to purge this sin. So in this case, the fault of evil is not necessarily God, and it's not mankind. It is the act of angels. Satan, though, is a leader of angels in heaven, not participating at all with the fallen angels. So in this case, Satan is being kept purely in the realm of that which is assisting God. I hope that comes across. Now, it is said that these angels have followed the way of Satan, and that would be to imply that Satan tempts people, but he tempts them for a purpose, whereas these angels are doing so in a dishonorable fashion. They are actually instigating this evil for selfish gain. So it is layered. It is a bit confusing, but still these lines are distinct. And this is a curious story in our story as well, because this is where I believe the idea of fallen angels is introduced. From a literary perspective, this seems to be the point where this concept of angels being capable of falling and sinning is introduced. The New Testament will run with this quite a lot, but this is being written roughly 300 years prior to that. About 200 years before the books of the New Testament are written, the book of Jubilees is introduced. And this is where you want to look if you are looking to read some real devil lore. Satan here isn't regularly referred to as Satan, though. He's referred to as mastema, which translates as hatred. There's plenty of interesting intersection between what is considered non-canonical and what is considered canonical when it comes to the Book of Jubilees. For instance, all the demons being purged of the world via the flood, but Satan or mastema asking for 10% of them, roughly, to remain on the world to test humanity. In this book, overall, Satan is retained as it was in the Old Testament, in the sense that, yes, he is hatred. Yes, this is a bad picture of fallen angels and such, but it is still permitted by God. So this testing of humanity and evils remaining in the world is given permission. Let's transition, though, to the New Testament, because that's where this really develops. And the technicalities give that away. In the Old Testament, Satan is named 27 times, and a fair amount of those times it is simply just meaning enemy or adversary. It isn't the Satan. But when it comes to the New Testament, Satan occurs 36 times, and it is almost exclusively the Satan, naming the character. And at large, Satan in the New Testament takes on a much more active role. This much more active presence changes the interpretation of the Old Testament and carries with it a number of implications going forward. For instance, the devil tries to tempt Jesus into bowing before him in exchange for riches, glory and riches, which would imply that the devil has domain over these things. And this will set a precedence with a lot of implications. The implication that the devil rules over the material world has an inherently Gnostic implication. The Gnostic implication is that the evil one rules the material world. This has a layered conversation when it comes to discussing Christianity, why they so often turned ascetic and monastic, denied the body of all of its sensual pleasures, why there's this fixation on not practicing any form of sexual gratification. This association between material pleasures, bestial world, and Satan. So it's a much more of a doubling down on what Satan did in the book of Job. Now it's much more layered and much more nefarious and sinister, collectively sinister. So it very much seems in the time between the Old Testament and the New, the identity of Satan has been much more fledged out. He's been given a status and a power that is beyond his original characterization. But his elevation certainly doesn't dispel a lot of the confusion around the character. And one of the biggest and strangest instances of this is the identification with Lucifer. Now, it's very common, most of anybody would know, that the interpretation is that Lucifer and Satan are the same. Lucifer is the previous angel form of Satan. However, this is not straightforward. You have to really squint to make this work biblically. Now, Lucifer, or the morning star, or the planet Venus, has deep mythological associations. The morning star certainly does appear to fall below the horizon line. And if it falls below the horizon line, then it is in the underworld. Literally, you can see the action of this happening. Again, I have to ask, are we assuming that angels are constellatory? Are we assuming that they are astral bodies observable in the skies? And if this is the case, if Lucifer is an angel, why does he not have L at the end of his name? Every angel has L at the end of the name. At the very least, this is biblically 100% true. Gabriel, Raphael. The name Lucifer only occurs once. It's in Isaiah 14, 1 through 12. In a monologue that is given to be a taunt for the king of Babylon, it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, Lucifer, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations." That's it. Is this use of Lucifer or the morning star actually just simply an allegory used to display a point to the king of Babylon? By itself, it seems like there's nothing to go off of unless you want to try to stitch it together. And I find the way that they do this very perplexing, very strange. You go back to Ezekiel 28, and you look throughout this verse that is all in regards to the ruler of Tyre. Again, that's what they're referred to as, not anything else. This is the ruler of Tyre they're referring to. And it has lines like, "And I expelled you, guardian cherub, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end, and you will be no more." This is all somehow interpreted to be Lucifer, and thus Satan, which is such a leap to me. Instead, you might look to the Gospel of Luke, now again to the New Testament, and it says, "And I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning," which this line, if you look at this verse of Luke, it seems to come out of nowhere. And what is it saying by all of a sudden stating that I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning? To connect all these things together, I genuinely don't understand. To look at what I've displayed to you and to firmly believe that this one-off mention of Lucifer is directly confirming biblically that that is Satan, instead of any of this being figurative or allegorical. What I really want to point out here is that we've inherited an interpretation, and if you look at the source material, you can interpret this very differently. If we want to take this interpretation seriously, then we assume that the devil is the king of Tyre, and that the king of Tyre is Lucifer, and that would mean that Lucifer is anomalously an unfit angel name. There's no L in the name, or pointed out that it's an angel necessarily. And that the devil is a cherub because it's named so as the king of Tyre in that tirade, that the devil is a cherub, but canonically speaking, cherubs have 4 faces, as we saw in Ezekiel, yet somehow the devil is going to be a serpent later, or is a red goat man. This is all so strange, because the other assumption generally is that Lucifer was the closest to God. But if that was the case, then he wouldn't be a cherub, he would be a seraphim. And if he was a seraphim, then he would be a snake. Do you see how strange this is? How confusing, perplexing this leap is? I think it's messier to assume that Lucifer and Satan are the same character. I don't think Lucifer is much of a character at all. I think it's a one-off reference. But that is my reading. I invite you to look at what I'm referencing here and come to your own thoughts on this. Suffice it to say, for now, that this is very unclear. But we have another perplexing and somewhat exhaustive subject to bring up, and that's Revelations. And in Revelations, we'll start by bringing up Abaddon. Yet again, we have another word that could be a name, question mark. This Abaddon translates as destruction. This word occurs throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New, and is usually accompanied with the word Sheol, and that is the underworld. So the place of the dead and this association with Abaddon. For instance, in Job, it says, Sheol is naked before him, Abaddon has no cover. These instances of bringing up the underworld, and there it is the word Abaddon, destruction. And in the Old Testament, in Job, we do have an instance where Abaddon is personified. It says, quote, Abaddon and death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. So this is strange because not only is Abaddon being personified, but also death is being personified. And normally, when we're thinking of Christian canon, we don't think of death as a being. But if we are to take other instances of such in the Bible as serious, for instance, the aforementioned Belial, or here with Abaddon, or Lucifer, for that matter, if these things are mentioned, are they entities or are they phenomena? Like with the discussion of the devil or Satan in the Old Testament, where the word enemy was used plenty of times without it referring to the character, it takes us a long time to really give name, entity to Abaddon. And that happens in Revelations. It says, quote, a king, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek Apollyon, in Latin Exterminus. And yet again, we have a confounding implication. Are the former mentions of this character, or the word destruction, now this angel? When it comes to trying to interpret this now named character, it completely depends on who you ask, what church father's interpretation, or even what apocrypha you want to take the word from. Certain apocrypha would make it very clear that this is the devil. Other apocrypha would say that when this was an angel, he was the one that brought the clay to make mankind. Variable church fathers might say that this is the Antichrist. Again, though, this is an open question, and the Bible isn't at all making it clear how this should be interpreted. But yet again, we have another open question of, is this also the devil? Revelations at large is confounding. You don't often see church fathers or priests mention it because it has strange implications. If Revelations is like any other chapters in the whole collection of the Bible, then it's like Daniel or Ezekiel in how absolutely odd its imagery is. But nonetheless, you've already seen me have to quote it several times in order to justify the assumptions, the interpretations about this character of Satan and the devil. Here, the devil is appearing uniquely distinct, different than he has in his former appearances. Here, he's much more of this primordial chaos monster, much more like the Leviathan. These strange quotes that the serpent lays at the feet of the virgin waiting to eat the child. This is, in my mind, very on the nose astrotheological. Like I mentioned before in the session, Satan is the serpent. That in the constellations is near the feet of Virgo, the constellation Virgo, which is at the appointed time of year where the sun will rise from. But this is not a session on Revelations. That will require its own time. However, church fathers in the future, beyond the Bible, Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, will interpret this distinctive change of persona of Satan as proof that he seeks to now be independent of God and becomes the very thing that we think the devil is now, the way that people interpret it now, that the devil has always aspired to become as great as God, confirming the Lucifer interpretation, all of that. But this would have had to happen off screen, per se. This would have had to happen at some point unmentioned by the Bible. But there is this interpretation, and this interpretation is what's gone forward in time, that this is what's happening with Satan. But when it comes to the Bible and what's been said, we can't assume that this is any different than the dynamic between God and Satan in Job. That this is in fact an orchestration, a agreement between them. That God could, in a different interpretation, be utilizing negative forces towards a greater aim. Again, just a different possibility. Nonetheless, though, we're getting all of this deduction from Revelations. They say that the devil rules hell, right? Well, actually, all it says is that after this great fight happens, and after 1,000 years, the devil would rise again and he'll be casted back into the lake of fire. However, that's all it says, is that the devil will be cast into the lake of fire. Never that he rules it, but only that he'd be punished in it with the other angels that fell. Revelations 20:10, and the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. So there it is. That's all there is. If we are to assume that the devil somehow rules hell, that is the line that we have to go off of. So only later is the interpretation given that Satan is a former angel and that Lucifer is the one and the same, that he's the first angel and he's the leader of all the angels that had a rebellion and that they all fell. This is all headcanon, is what I'm saying. It's not stated. The popular interpretation of Satan ruling hell is very much given by the Divine Comedy, written by Dante, more than 1,000 years after this was written. So, anyway, the point I want to make here is that we can't take any of this for granted. But I want to step out of that, and instead, let's tend to some greater distillations, because this has been a lot of information. Even in this relatively short session in comparison to the 2,000-ish years that it's taken to flush out this character, to decide how it ought to be interpreted and so forth. Even in what we've covered here, we've seen quite the change when it comes to how this character has been personified, how much attention was paid to this character. And if we just think back to Satan as he appears in the Old Testament, he's overall fairly insubstantial. A side reference, if anything, not the focus by any means. But the New Testament very much wants to make this Ahura Mazda Angra Manu sort of appeal, this greater distance to create that duality. Again, it assists with the change of how to explain evil. You can see why this interpretation of the devil willing to be independent as an explanation of his distinctive tonal change and revelations as convenient. If we make that the devil's job, then that leaves space for God to now be his other distinctive self, which is much more about peace, love, and beneficence. That was a distinctive change between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. So accordingly, the God of the Old Testament is very willing to say, I am the one that causes suffering. I will send plagues to people that don't follow with the law that I say in this book. And that has many interpretations, to be fair. But regardless, since the New Testament has a God that is much more going to talk about love, much more going to talk about forgiveness. Jesus is an embodiment of that. Then he's leaning into that beneficent persona of God. And accordingly, it leaves that vacuum, that open space that now needs to be filled by this now casted role of Satan as the antagonist. The devil as big, bad, wrong, is uniquely Christian as opposed to Jewish. It's uniquely a part of the New Testament, much more so than it is a part of the Old Testament. And I think there are implications there. The interpretation of the devil being Lucifer, being a fallen angel, is not purely biblical. The interpretation that he seeks to actually subvert the power of God is not purely biblical. The belief in the devil is strange. And what do I mean? The more that the devil is believed in and given lip service, the worse things get. In that, the more that people call each other the devil or refer to other people as acting on behalf of the devil, the more that bad things happen. Anyway, let's answer some of the questions posed in the beginning. Does the devil rule hell? Not confirmed. Biblically, not stated. It says that he'll go there when he's punished in Revelation specifically. That's it. Is the devil Lucifer? Huge leap of interpretation. By my reading, confounding interpretation. Is the devil a fallen angel? Again, confounding interpretation. I don't know how. Look into it for yourself. Inconclusive. Does the devil act against God? It would very much appear so in Revelations. Otherwise, outside of Revelations, there really isn't any hint of that. The devil tempting Jesus very much could appear in the same way as the devil tempting Job, as someone who tests, as very much a being acting on behalf of God. Is the serpent the devil? Specifically, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That is assumed simply because in Revelations, the devil takes the form of a serpent. And by proxy, they assume that he must have been the serpent back then. I find this also a challenging leap, a challenging assumption. There has been many interpretations of the serpent in the garden, especially in early Christianity. So that one's open to me. Who is Belial? Who is Abaddon? Again, completely open. Are they the devil? Are they not the devil? What do you think? What does the devil look like? Other than being dignified as a dragon and a serpent in form in Revelations, there is absolutely nothing to go off of biblically. And so then finally, what is the devil's role? And I think it's been made very clear throughout this session that the devil is an extension of God's will, especially in the Old Testament. But it is put into question strongly by what happens in Revelations. What has been the point of all of this? I want to speak plainly. The way that this book has been interpreted is questionable. And I think that's beneficial. I think we inherit a lot of mythos and a lot of lore about this book. And this book has a lot to offer for both Christians and non-Christians. And in that vein, I think it should be earnestly questioned and earnestly investigated. A lot has been done in the name of this character. A lot of wrong has been done to good people in the name of this mythos, of this interpretation of this character. And so I think it's important that we actually look at the source material and that we openly question this inherited interpretation. When it comes to the occult traditions or the magical traditions from the Middle Ages or the alchemical traditions, so much of it gets tied up with discussions of Luciferianism or Satanism or this really sinister demonicness. And if that isn't as straightforward as it's been made to seem, then we have a very different, more nuanced, much more original way of navigating that material. Not to subvert, not to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, but quite the opposite. To actually come to a novel interpretation of the reality of these things. To get an esoteric look at Christianity as opposed to an inherited exoteric look at Christianity. But this has all been on the Bible itself. This doesn't answer what people have done with it. And in that, we could say many things, and that will deserve its own session. People generally have used the term to designate anything that they don't understand, or anything that isn't culturally what they're comfortable with. If they don't recognize it, it's the devil. And so, in that way, the devil can appear anywhere. Anything that is unknown and anything that you don't immediately perceive as comfortable and safe is the devil. But if we earnestly want to consider instead the actual becoming of life, we need the tester as much as we need the comfort. We need suffering as much as we need hope. We need to dip down in order to dip up. This is a yin-yang process of becoming. It's a nuanced conversation. And so duality is up for question here. The nature of evil has been an ongoing conversation throughout humanity's storytelling history. And we're not done with that discussion. That discussion continues, and how we wish to navigate it, how we wish to understand it, how we wish to cope with it is ever ongoing. Grief, discipline, sorrow, hurt, pain, all of this is a part of the human condition. But without placating and giving some weird morale, this has all been the devil in the details, a potential reinterpretation of the biblical devil.
That there are things on earth still hidden from us. Secret things. Dark and mysterious.
The Spiritual Studies course is an ongoing effort towards offering free public education on matters of spirituality, religion, comparative mythology, culture, philosophy, history, so forth. If you enjoyed this session, consider helping the course continue. There's a Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. This helps to buy me a book for research or simply helps the course continue. Members can benefit from commentaries, early access, and a nod at the end of the video. And speaking of that, if you enjoyed this session, it's in thanks to all the members. This time I want to name all the members as they currently are in thanks for this session. And that is SJ, Missy, Ariel the Gray, the Philosophical Minds Podcast, Maggie, Slow Leak, John Crestwell, the Satyr Witch, Kristen, Nora, Lucy, the Irrational Sage, Scorson, and Craig Mitchell. Stay curious and keep wondering.